Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm the chair of the Religion and International Relations section for the International Studies Association. And for the last 3 years, we have run with the ISA Virtual Programming, a book talk series looking at recent publications that touch on the question of religion and international relations, or culture and international relations. So this is a session that will be devoted to the book of Vinícius Rodrigues Vieira called Shaping Nations and Markets, Identity, Trade, and Populist Rage. And he will be joined by two discussants, Zlatko Adedic from CNRS, actually my previous home, my previous professional home, but he's not in Paris, he's in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Asima Sina, from Claremont University. So while people are joining us, I would like to give you a couple of practical information. First, the session is recorded. So it will be uploaded later on the YouTube channel of the ISA Virtual Programming. You can ask questions through three ways. You can write them in the Q&A, you can raise your hand, or you can write them in the chat as well. Any other point I can make is that if you ask a question, you do not have to identify yourself, but if you want to, it's welcome as well. Okay, so while people are joining us, I would like to give the floor first to Professor Vinícius Rodrigues Vieira to present his book. So you have the floor for 10 minutes. I'm going to be very keen on keeping the time up. So I may at some point, if you go beyond 10 minutes, send you a little warning through the chat. So look at the chat. I know that when people talk, they don't tend to look at the chat, but I won't interrupt you, but I will send you a little warning. So Vinícius, you have the floor.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much, Jocelyn. Thank you very much for hosting me today and our discussants. It's an honor to present my book in this space and the Religion on IR group, and having two very well qualified discussants, Zlatko and Asima. So here is just a snapshot of my main arguments and a brief reflection on the main cases, namely Brazil, India, and the United States. So to begin with, I think it's relevant to say that Shaping Nations and Markets relies on a mixed methods approach to make the following point: economic ideas, organization of domestic interests, and the power that comes from that organization, asymmetries of information, and political institutions per se, they are not enough to explain the formation of national interests in trade liberalization. We need what I call a missing eye, and this missing eye can be translated into this concept that I try to advance in the manuscript: identity capital. The idea is that depending on the concentration of certain identities that are expressed in the form of national identity, can be religious identity, can be ethnic or racial identity, they may empower those identities, either liberalizing or protectionist interests. And here we have a very brief definition of identity capital. That means the economic sector, like agriculture, like chemical industry, automobile making, mining, any kind of economic sector with stakes in trade, the contribution of that sector to the stability of a given national identity narrative. And how do we measure that according to what I argued in the book? We try to measure that by verifying the proportion of people of the workforce in a given sector that is affiliated, that claims to have a given identity, racial, ethnic, that is representative of the dominant conception of national identity. So, based on that, we argue that sectors, and I'll give you a few examples later in the presentation as well as in this discussion, depending on the questions. We have, for instance, here in Brazil, where I'm currently based, an agribusiness sector, a more diverse workforce rooted on a non-white people. That translates a given ideal of national identity. More recently, a high proportion of Christian people also translates an alternative conception of national identity. Likewise, in India, certain sectors have, as we're talking about religion, Hindu majorities, while other sectors don't have such a high proportion of Hindus. And that creates imbalances that may prompt sectors to have more or less power as they lobby the state for pursuing certain trade policies. So, based on the identity capital concept, I try to build a theory that tries to unpack the process for which the populist rage emerged in the 21st century, linking demands for trade liberalization, but also for trade protectionism, and how that has culminated in the demands for populist movements, particularly on the right wing, in the main cases that I'm exploring, not only Brazil and India that I already mentioned, but also the United States. And the key element for analyzing whether there will be more demands for liberalization or protectionism in a given nation lies in verifying how much identity capital the economic sectors that are mostly liberalizing or protectionist have. And why Brazil, India, and the United States? As you may know, all those three countries, they are not only federal, multicultural, diverse nations with competing definitions of national identity, but also they had three main populist leaders in recent times on the right. Bolsonaro here in Brazil, Modi, that is still the prime minister of India, and that is facing a quest for a third term and is very likely to succeed, and Donald Trump in the United States, who's trying to return to power. But my point of analysis starts much earlier, 2001. Why? It's when those three countries, they were protagonists of the negotiations of the Doha Development Round of the World Trade Organization, arguably the most comprehensive project of liberalizing trade in a worldwide scale. So, how to link what is happening nowadays with what happened in the beginning of the century? Here we adopt a long duration trend, a long duration perspective. And the goal is to show that not necessarily trade liberalization or trade protectionism is associated to the rise of populist trends, particularly because if something unites those three cases, apart from the quest for more trade liberalization sometimes more trade protectionism, is the fact that there are disputes around what it means to be Brazilian, Indian, and American. And therefore, there are disputes around the definition of identity capital. So it means that first and foremost, we must look at where those countries, they lie in terms of the process of what I call the redistribution of identity capital in order to empower more sectors over others, liberalizing over protectionists, and vice versa. And here I offer you a snapshot of what, of course, based on a more comprehensive set of data, relying, as I said before, on quantitative and qualitative methods, the findings for each country. So in Brazil, under the presence of Bolsonaro, there was a clear demand for trade openness. What casts doubts over the claim that right-wing populism is essentially protectionist. Not only Bolsonaro was reclaiming more trade liberalization on behalf of agribusiness sector, but he also has a clear agenda for resetting the national identity in Brazil that is rooted on the ideal of racial diversity and transfer that ideal, replace that ideal, better said, by the idea that Brazil is essentially a Christian nation, what, of course, not everyone agrees with. India, Modi also pursues economic liberalization, although his record on this matter has been quite mixed, and hopefully we'll have more time during the discussion to cover that. But clearly he's advancing an agenda of Hindu majoritarianism. That's not only, I would say, a consensus in the social sciences, but clearly there is an evidence, a robust set of evidence that it is a huge departure from the previous ideas around secularism in India that, although have never been fully fulfilled, they used to be the core of Indian conception of nationality. And in the United States, then we find this traditional idea that is, let's say, the gold standard, in my view at least, of what right-wing populism is in terms of combining nationalism, combining an inward-looking approach, protectionism. Just think of Trump pursuing more and more protection. My time is coming to an end, but I think here that I presented most of my argument, but really to wrap up and then open the space for my discussants. And once again, I'd like to thank them to take time for having taken the time to discuss my work. Here we have therefore a contribution to understand whether the rise of nationalism, populism, and therefore the recovery of religion along with ethnicity and race as key elements in shaping international relations, but also, of course, domestic politics, is a matter of only economic protectionism as narratives and accounts based mainly in the global north is what prevails, or is it a matter of cultural nationalism? We have here a combination of both elements because identity capital, of course, doesn't operate alone. In the United States, as I already argued, protectionism is linked to whiteness, but those two other cases, we have the opposite. We have the pursuit of liberalization, at least at the rhetorical level, and measures that, as I argue in the book, are associated to the liberalization of those two markets in the global south, Brazil and India. So I stop here. Thank you very much again, Jocelyn, for the space. I stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to hear your questions, your comments, and of course, the discussants that, again, thank you very much for you to take the time to read my work.
Thank you, Vinícius. So I give the floor to Professor Adi Dedic, Zlatko, as we will call him from now on.
It was perfectly pronounced. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So it wouldn't make sense that I keep repeating what my predecessor has already said about his book. So I think that perhaps the most fruitful approach would be that I try to look at the same argument from the other side, from the side that I presented in my own book, which was also published by Routledge. I will show it here. Nations and Capital, the Missing Link in Global Expansion. In the 9th century, in the final chapter, I was presenting a very similar argument to what Vinícius was presenting about the link between something which I do not properly call populism. I tend to call it authoritarian nationalism. I think that we are facing a phenomenon which is more complex and which is probably broader than what people normally tend to assume when they say populism. I think that we are facing a new type of nationalism at the very beginning of the 21st century. I just have to explain that my basic idea is that actually capitalism cannot live and cannot survive without nationalism, because it has a self-destructive mechanism which creates a gap between the top 1 or the top 5 and the rest of the population, to such an extent that it permanently creates a potential for rebellion among the masses. And especially with neoliberalism, with the rise of neoliberalism and globalism, this gap is becoming even sharper, even more present than in the traditional form of nationalism, which relies on democratic procedures, which relies on the idea of popular sovereignty. Now we are facing something else. Now we are facing a gap which cannot be bridged by common nationalism based on democratic principles. Instead, we are facing a new type of nationalism based on authoritarian principles. I would say that both Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, everyone that you have mentioned in the book as well, that all these leaders are actually introducing a new type of nationalism. So I tend to call it new type of nationalism rather than populism. And the whole point is whether we can actually look at the whole process of liberalization and neoliberalism as something which is presented as a kind of globalization. Globalization is a kind of humane face of neoliberalism. Whether we can actually look at it in the form of national interests and national identity as collective forms. I would say that in capitalism, primarily we have private interests, we have private capital. And this private capital and these private interests, they create the gap that I have already mentioned. And they are trying to bridge this gap through nationalism. And it is, in my view, very disputable whether we can actually talk about these categories in the proper sense as national interest, which is defined by the state or which the state defines by itself. I think that it is a kind of facade for something else, which capitalism and as an individualist type of what is the right word? Getting wealth, I would say, rather than anything else. Whether we can actually label the form that we get, which is sponsored by the state, covered by the state, whether we can call it properly national interest, or it is actually always individual interest, which is covered by something which is labeled as national. So I definitely do think that we are facing a new type of nationalism. We may well call it populism. We may also say that it is essentially linked with neoliberalism. But in my view, it is disputable whether we can use these categories in the proper sense, such as national identity and national interest. But I would say that the most interesting part in the book is definitely the introduction of the category of identity capital. It is something which is definitely plausible as a category which definitely can be defined the way that Vinícius has defined it. And I think it is especially connected to Pierre Bourdie's category of fields. It is something which is really interesting and which is plausible as a category which needs to be introduced. And I very welcome it, the way it has been described and defined by Vinícius in his own book. It is something which needs to be introduced in order to actually define how society operates, whether capital as such and the market as such can operate without the influence by the society, and what kind of influence society has on the market. I wouldn't go that far to say that the only categories that we are facing are liberalization and protectionism. I would say that we can probably introduce many more categories in describing what happens with the market when there is influence by society. But in any case, I think that the idea to put these two things together is very fruitful, and it is something which really needs to be expanded. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to read this book before I wrote my own book. And to some extent, I believe that Vinícius also would have preferred to have read my book before he started writing his own book, because we have many similar ideas, but we are starting from two different perspectives, from two different points of view. In any case, I believe that this book is very interesting and it can be expanded further, especially this idea about the relationship between society and the market and how they operate. I think that there is a lot of things to write about along these lines, and I would really welcome yet another book on this topic being written by Vinícius, or by the two of us together, or by someone else. But I really do believe that it is something which needs to be expanded further.
Thank you, Zlatko. And now I'm giving the floor to Professor Sina.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and it's a privilege to be commenting on this book by Vinícius. So, you know, as I think Vinícius knows, I belong to I work on political economy of trade. My second book was on India's integration with the WTO, and I espouse in that book the kind of framework that he modifies. So it was really productive for me to think about his book. I think what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is talk about 4 important contributions of this book, and then raise some questions about some aspects of those arguments. So the first, and I'm going to quickly share my screen and share with you a few thoughts so that you can think about what I'm saying. So I think the conventional wisdom about trade and Polanyi, and I think this book is a Polanyi-esque version. You know, it modifies and expands Polanyi in an interesting way. So the conventional wisdom about trade and Polanyi is articulated by Jeffrey Garrett, who argues that when there is economic insecurity, or economic insecurity among broad sections of society, then governments will use policy to address those insecurities. And so governments are interested in social stability in addition to growth. And I think to this idea, Vinícius' book contributes this idea that people who are negatively affected or even positively affected by globalization have symbolic interest, that are not only have interest in terms of economic security, but they also have identity-based, identity-based interest or, symbolic interest. And so, and political actors in response would like to respond not only to economic security by adding welfare benefits or addressing the economic security, but they also use symbolic policies. In this case, he argues that populism is a kind of a symbolic or a national identity. And the other discussant, Latko, argues in an interesting way that nationalism might be also one response to the unintended effects of globalization. So the first contribution that that this book really makes is that it is, in addition to economic security, symbolic interests are important. So essentially, the book is really updating Polanyi for recent developments. It's going beyond interest, institutions, and even ideas. And the way the author, Vinícius, defines identity capital is sector's contribution to the stability of the national identity. It is important to note for the audience that Vinícius locates his idea in a question about power, but power is understood both in terms of material power and symbolic power. Now, I want to mention how this argument has resonance in comparative politics. Peter Hall, and Peter Hall kind of belongs, according to Vinícius, to the ideas framework. But the way he thinks about ideas has some overlap with this book, which is that politics is not only a contest for power, it's also a struggle for the interpretation of interest. So the power and politics is about the interpretation of interest. And according to, this book, Vinícius' book, he really is adding to what is the meaning of interpretation of interest and what are the perceptions. And perceptions are located in symbolic interest. I'll quickly quote, although I don't have too much time to, but this is a very important quote from the book, which is, the players are struggling not only for material needs, but also for symbolic needs. And so the adding of symbolic, in addition to security needs or protectionist needs, he's adding the notion of symbolic face of the nation idea. I want to discuss in a minute this definition of identity capital. And identity capital is sector's contribution to the stability of the narrative, to national identity. And the way he defines it is, the larger the proportion of people working within a sector who are associated with the dominant narrative, the higher is the identity capital of that sector. So there is a sectoral emphasis in how identity capital is viewed. The second contribution of the book really is about a sociological view of markets, not as disembodied consumers or firms, but he relies on economic sociological view where markets are located in society, and markets themselves are not just firms or consumers, but they are also it's a field itself. So market is reconceptualized using Flick's time. So that's his second contribution. I just skipped this. Now, I want to emphasize one aspect of his contribution and then come to my comments. So, in my view, there are two versions of Vinícius' argument. I think that his argument is about an interactive dynamic. It's on page 6, for example, he argues that he's wanting to integrate the identity capital in conventional understandings of institutions or instrumental ideas of interest. So, one comment I had was that there are at places the book argues that he is integrating a missing variable, or he's talking about a missing variable, that all the other approaches don't talk about that missing variable. And I think that his contribution really is in showing us that identity capital is an intermediate variable, but affects interests, institutions, and other variables in trade policy. So he, at other points, also talks about identity capital as a tiebreaker between liberalizing and protectionist coalition. So I want to highlight this interactive dynamic of his argument, which appears in a number of places. So that is one version, the way I read his argument. At other places, I think he wants to also suggest that it's not interactive, but identity capital is independently important. And then he has analysis of populism. So that's another contribution. Now, I want to kind of, in my comments, I want to kind of highlight something about his conceptual architecture and mention how, clarification on that conceptual architecture would have benefited the book. So, we know that he has the book has a notion of markets as fields. And he talks about how markets and societies and identities are mutually constitutive. And I want to, for our purpose of our discussion, I want to say that there are different versions of such a mutual constitution. There is language of embeddedness, but it could be viewed in different ways. It could be that markets are within society. That's one view. The other could be that markets and societies overlap. So the market, at some points, so for example, in 2001, different countries are pursuing liberalization, according to Vinícius, because especially in India, because they are pursuing global export markets for India. But there is an overlap, but they are overlapping, but they are not embedded completely. So that's the second version of mutual constitution. The third is, I think, this thing, and sorry for my drawing, but I was trying to quickly draw these things. One version of his argument could be that society and markets are autonomous. And I was wondering, maybe in the comments or response, that he could tell us whether he believes in the first graph or first figure in which markets are embedded in society, or the second or the third. And I would love to hear his thoughts on this. Now, the one other clarification question or a discussion question I had was that it appears that his notion of stability and identity is that the business power, which is essentially an interest-based variable, comes from capital owners, but identity capital comes from the workforce. So I was wanting a little more clarification on whether businesses themselves are also aspiring or espousing the national identity in the relevant country or not. Is it only a phenomena that affects the workforce, or the fact that national leaders are articulating the idea of workforce? So, I just wanted a little more discussion on why Vinícius focuses on the workforce when he's talking about identity capital. So is it that the business power is articulated the economic interest, but they are not interested in identity capital? I kind of had a question. The issue with populism I wanted to articulate in the following way is that, as it happens, all three countries in more recent times are examples of right-wing populism, right? I think that's what Vinícius argues. And I was wondering if in some ways, his analysis of populism and trade policy and identity capital is relevant to an understanding of right-wing populism. But I was wondering what he would say, what his argument would say to other periods in South Asia or Latin America, where left-wing populism has been a prominent part of the government's position, and whether their economic policy or trade policy has reflected that. So, for example, Indira Gandhi in India in the 60s and 70s, and then even Pakistan has articulated left-wing populism. Now, so the left-wing populism so a different kind of populism, does it have a different identity base? Is a question that appeared to me. Now, I was intrigued by how much time do I have, Jocelyn?
Your time is up.
Okay, my time is up, so I'll stop there. But so those were the questions that I had: how to conceptualize markets and society, how to think about identity capital in terms of workforce versus business owners, and then how does the argument about populism expand to left-wing, populism? So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Asima. So before I give back to Vinícius the mic, I would like to add a few comments myself, because I think it's another orientation, mostly regarding the religion and IR, but also most significantly, I want to make 2 points. The one on the relevance and significance of nation, and second on what is populism exactly. So I read the book with great interest, because it's part of a new thread of literature that started by, when it comes to culture and religion and identity, lots of emphasis in the discipline has been put on actors, social movement, and then the turn was on the state. And what I've been pushing for in the last 5 years, and that's the book I published a couple of years back on We God's People, is the importance of nation, not nationalism. And that's why I have some question with you, because the two are not the same. A nation is a fundamental political modern community, and we have not explored enough the way it has changed the parameters. In my case, I look at religion, but in your case, it's political economy. We are not paying attention enough, and I cannot be more in agreement with you than to put the spotlight on that. But it also means looking at beyond ideas, as you say several times in the book, beyond interest and beyond institutions. But the two are linked, all the three, sorry, are linked. It's not neither, no, it's the three together. So nation in this case, I think the identity capital is an interesting point, and I see the influence of Bourdieu indeed here, including the fields that we call in French le champ, but I don't know if field or champ is exactly the same. But why you don't use the term habitus? Because what you are really looking into is a national habitus, the building of a national habitus. So of course, your book cannot work on showing this national, or on analyzing in detail the national habitus, but you have way to capture it. And here I would also make the connection with populism. Ernest Laclau, who is an author that has written a lot on populism, talk about sedimented practices. Sedimented practices are the main norms, ideas, values that everybody share without ever questioning them, and that even opponents, political opponents, share. That's the same thing than a national habitus. So when you, that's what in the book left me a little on my first, there was like, so what is identity capital? You use it, but I don't think there is a real definition. It's not a sector as such. It is the hidden part of the iceberg on which what you are describing, in this case, political or economic policies or market logics are happening, and that is based for each community on a sort of consensus of what we think is right or wrong, or what kind of value we put in some kind of initiative. And indeed, the state leaders have to take this into account, not only because they are savvy or clever or they manipulate, but because they share, or there is something shared in there that can make this work. So, and again, that's what I did with religion. I didn't look at religion as ideas. I look at religion, actually, nations were built on the dismissal of the previous community that was the religion. There was no national community that has not been associated with the reshuffling of the religious community, not religious ideas or beliefs, the religious community, which is not the same than religious ideas. So this brings me to populism. Again, the connection here would be to look at what Ernest Laclau has done on sedimented practices, and you know, if you look at populism this way, you cannot have a certain type of populism that is not in echo or resonance with the national habitus, and that's what. That's why, because I have this chapter on India in this last book, I was trying to say, no, but there is this argument and this argument that come from the fact that the national community of India was based on a reshuffling of what is Hindu communities, what are they, what do they mean, and so you have all this underneath part of clusters of meaning that are there, but they are not always automatically mobilized in the public domain or what you would call the field, but they are there. And so that's why, if I can close that on a nutshell, that's why interdisciplinary is key, not to make you a specialist of India or of I would say identity, but there are tons of work that could be used to enrich your approach and make it even more resonant with this new trend I was mentioning. So I stop here because I can talk much more about all that, but congrats, and I really, really like the book, and it should be read outside political economy, let's put it this way. So, Vinícius, do you want to respond to all of us?
Yeah, I think it's a good approach if I now respond, so perhaps you can make further comments. So first of all, thank you very much for all your comments, Zafko, Asima, and Jocelyn. They are very helpful. They really contribute to advancing the argument and, of course, thinking of new projects. I was taking notes while you were talking, so please ask me again if you feel that I didn't cover anything that you raised. I'll go here in the order that you spoke, but trying to make connections as much as I can across your different points. So beginning with Zachary, yeah, it's a really pity that I couldn't read Nations and Capital before I completed my manuscript. Your book was set to be published by the same series and was already in the production process, but I didn't have access, what is a pity. But definitely we should consider doing something together or mobilizing colleagues to work on those topics in the near future. Time constraints allowing that, certainly it would be very interesting. And I totally agree that your last chapter really dovetails with what I'm discussing. However, I really have to spend more time thinking to what extent we are really facing a new type of nationalism, that is namely authoritarian nationalism. And let me explain why. Perhaps I'm departing from a global South Latin American experience in which nationalism was, according to many authors, and I tend to agree with that view, was built from a top-down perspective. And in the sense, let me just briefly go to Asima's point on left-wing populism versus right-wing populism, and why perhaps, although we can still distinguish between populism and nationalism or authoritarian nationalism, perhaps populism can be understood as the pathway for building authoritarian nationalism, and later it shall be replaced by what we see in the democratic world, democratic nationalism. Let me elaborate a little bit on that, considering particularly the case of Brazil and other Latin American countries that around the 20s and the 30s of the last century embarked on an enterprise of building national identity or reframing national identity. For instance, here in Brazil, our conceptions of national identity that incorporated particularly the non-European elements, and out of the non-European elements, the African elements in contributing to build what Brazil is nowadays, only emerged and were only incorporated by the state in the 30s under the leadership of Getúlio Vargas, who is like Perón for Brazil. He's a controversial character that governed over a revolution against the oligarchs first, but later embraced fascist elements in his dictatorship in late 30s. But in the 50s, he returned to power through the left, just to see how those categories are really mixed here in Latin America, and particularly in Brazil. Based on this experience, I'd say that Brazil would not have left aside its own image that remains largely among the elites as, let's say, European origin country, and replace that by the idea of a mixed syncretic country that incorporates indigenous European plus African contributions, were it not for that authoritarian period that, of course, was heavily problematic to be very elegant. But as a matter of fact, we only created this conception of national identity that is now Bolsonaro has been trying to replace that by a more Christian-focused conception of nationality, unless we had an authoritarian period. We had a kind of centralization of the state. Likewise, I may not know much about the periods that Asima mentioned in Pakistan particularly, but in India under Indira, this idea of secularism perhaps was only fully consolidated in the 70s, although it, of course, still has lots of contradictions in the Indian society. So I think in general, we can think of forms of building nationalism more as a top-down process than a bottom-up. Perhaps, of course, the European experience is different in that regard, but we have to consider that top-down processes may have been placed not only in current times, but also in terms of how those nations and those conceptions of national identity, particularly in the global south, were built, particularly either in midst liberation movements that were elite-led, but of course that relied on popular mobilization. Popular mobilization is always there. You would initially be tempted to argue, but not necessarily that implies in democratic processes. So that would be my initial reaction to what Zeppo brought in terms of distinguishing authoritarian nationalism of nowadays from populism and from previous forms of nationalism. Certainly, I agree with Zeppo in terms of the private interests and private capital would not be sustainable unless there would be this cohesive force that nationalism aims to build, and the very idea of national identity, I couldn't agree more. What brings me to Asima's point on who has the identity capital, the business or the workforce. I was struggling with myself as I built, particularly the empirical part of the book, which has been in place for a while. That started in my doctoral thesis in Oxford, where I focused only Brazil and India initially. And of course, at the time, between 2010 and 2014, I couldn't envision the rise of those right-wing authoritarian forces. But I tested empirically, and I think for the case of Brazil and India, I added a variable that considers only the identity of owners of capital, and that has no effect. And that goes in line with this idea that what matters really is the identity of the workforce. So trying to reconcile that with what Zeppo argued in terms of pacifying capital expansion, here I think we have a very straightforward explanation. For business, it's relevant to have identity capital of the workforce, even if they don't share the same identity. And just to exemplify, this is pretty clear in Brazil, where usually owners of agribusiness are, according to other studies, mostly white, while the workforce is non-white. But then they can stabilize society, they can stabilize the capital accumulation, and therefore empower themselves as a sector and as business owners with the help of the workforce. To bring the discussion to a more kind of Marxist left-leaning framework, that would be what Marxists would argue, something that I do not agree with, I must highlight. But that would be the idea of false consciousness, but not in terms only of class, but in terms of having a false consciousness, in terms of identifying more as a source of identity than as a kind of class identity. So that's, I think, is in line with what Zachary argues in terms of bringing stabilization. So for business, as long as they have power in terms of empowering their interests and assuming, as I assume in the book, that there's an alignment between capital owners and workers, they are not in opposition, because if a trade agreement fails and if they have a protectionist interest, both workers and capital owners, they are likely to face problems, at least in a first moment. If we assume that moving capital from one sector to another is quite hard, what can be the case in nations like Brazil and India, at least, where you have too much dependence on the state, on alliances with the state in order to build, of course, to build a new business, to open new business opportunities. More points here. I know that I've been talking for a while. If you allow me, let me just talk for 3 minutes more. So I have talked for 10 minutes, then you can reply to my comments if you want. Also, the other points raised by Asima, apart from business, I would like to highlight first, left-wing versus right-wing populism nowadays. I briefly mentioned the case of Mexico under López Obrador, who has been advancing a conception of national identity that's clearly more linked to the idea of mestizaje, mixing, which is pretty much in line with the Latin American tradition of opposing the construction of Latin America as purely as an European business. And that has some signs of authoritarianism. So definitely, as I show in chapter 9, it's where I could test with some limitations. I recognize the application of my argument to a large N setting, to a large N database. Being left or right doesn't matter for populists to mobilize ethnic, religious diversity in order to advance their projects. So I'd be tempted to say that although my 3 main cases are on the right, we certainly have this potential both mobilization of identity capital and therefore potential authoritarianism. What I highlight is not the case nowadays, as being linked to authoritarian nationalism in the line argued by Zappico. Other point that Asima raised, and then I briefly address Jocelyn's points that were more focused on this idea of religion, religious community being replaced by national community. Certainly, I conceive society as markets as autonomous, but as having a brief overlap. And so it would be like a Venn diagram in which there is a brief overlap, but not concentric circles. That's my conception. And in this sense, I would reject the argument that society entirely embeds markets. That's not the point, and they are not detachable. They have a brief overlap, and that brief overlap is where forms of economic power interact with what I argue that is identity capital. And that brings me to Jocelyn's relevant points. Certainly, we have to make this distinction between religion as an idea and religious community. Certainly, the nation replaced religion as a community, but there's still, and I think Jocelyn agrees with that, as a continuation of the use of religious ideas as part of the construction of national identity. And that's related, I think, to the term habitus, the national habitus. I think it's a great insight, and I must confess that in my original framework, I intended to use the full set of Bourdieu's conceptual tools, that is, field, capital, habitus, and praxis. However, as my analysis focused more and more on the macro level, I opted to leave aside habitus and praxis, but I'm very much winning future works as I focus more on the micro level dynamics, the incorporation of those two terms. But I totally agree that there's this creation of a national habitus in terms of what we take for granted, or to use another Bourdieu's very well-known concept, he used that a lot, as far as I know, the idea of doxa, that is what we take for granted. And whenever we have a stability in the conception of national identity, we have nothing but the doxa. So thank you again. Sorry if I took too much time to reply to your comments, but they are all very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, because we have an audience that has been very patient, and I see two questions here, so I'm going to give them to you. And Vinícius, you can take them on, but our two other colleagues as well. So the first one is, could economic dependence experienced by developing countries ruled by right-wing populists explain the latest proclivity to liberalize trade?
That's a good point here. I think the person who asked it, Julio Martinez Suarez, thank you very much for your question. That's a correlation that many argue that exists whenever we think of the criticism against Modi, but particularly against Bolsonaro in Brazil. And to bring another name that has been recently very much well discussed, and to which I think that my framework may eventually apply, Javier Milei in Argentina, that is right-wing populism, authoritarian nationalism, to use again that was well nicely put expression. They are actually advancing external interests, and that would eventually brings us back to the traditional literature on dependency. I think a way to reconcile that is to think of transnational alliances that are not only economic alliances, as traditional dependency theorists would argue. I'm here thinking more about Cardoso's and Faleto's dependence framework that talks about those alliances across capital, and to use a more recent author, David Harvey, the idea of transnational capitalist class, others advanced that concept as well. So in the sense, for instance, it would be undetachable in the case of names like Milei and Bolsonaro, that they conceive Brazil and Argentina, for instance, being essentially Christian, European, and therefore they have to conduct business and favor the interests of Europe and the United States, as Bolsonaro and more recently Milei, they mention very much openly in a quite, to be very honest, racist way, denying potential interactions that are worthwhile in economic terms with the global South, particularly China. So in the sense, I think that in the case at least of the global South, and particularly in the case of Latin America, I would see definitely the right-wing populists being more aligned with liberal ideas. Here, just to clarify, I'm not saying that all liberals in Latin America, they are authoritarian, not at all. There are liberals who are democratic. They are open about having a broad conception of national identity, but definitely the brand to which Milei and Bolsonaro, in my view, are affiliated, and particularly Bolsonaro more explicit, because Bolsonaro has a more state view of the economy than Milei, at least. He embraces some libertarian conceptions of economy that are different from Bolsonaro. But I think at the end, in terms of identity and how they place their countries in the world, are very much similar, and that would automatically imply in more trade liberalization without much concern about the redistributive effects, particularly in economic terms, but with a clear purpose of empowering certain groups in identity terms. In case of Brazil, as I explained before, the Christian majority, the evangelicals, but also some Catholics.
Thank you. Yes, Asima.
If I could answer this question, in my view, this question hints at a interesting dynamic between the global system and the domestic propensity to liberalize. And the puzzle that is introduced, or, we know that, not only Modi, but earlier, since starting from actually, 90s, India, there was a tendency to liberalize. But I don't think it can be explained by dependency, but you have to bring in the role of international factors. For example, India is really becoming more prominent in terms of export markets, actually in engineering and pharmaceuticals, textile, but also services. And so it is the changing nature of global system, which is then giving opportunity to Indian exporters and national governments, to then liberalize. So the puzzle, which is very fascinating in this whole comparison that Vinícius has done, is that United States is a case of protectionism, while India is a case of liberalization, more or less. I mean, there is some variation across sectors, but there is a trend towards greater liberalization of trade. And in my view, Hindus were still dominant in most sectors in agriculture in the 70s and 80s. What is not explained is why does liberalization happen in the 90s and 2000s? So I think there's a slight critique of Vinícius' argument, which is that Hindus were always dominant in all sectors in the 70s. So what really changes is the nature of global alignment, not necessarily dependency, but nature of global alignments gives economic and maybe rise, the notion of identity is important. Rising power, global system is recognizing the notion of rising powers. That's an identity-based idea. Although, there is an economic basis to it, but there's an identity-based idea. So when the global system begins to recognize emerging powers, or then Brazil, India, China, use those opportunities, both economic and interest-based opportunities, but also identity-based opportunities to then liberalize. So I think the global level has very important impacts, and to theorize how we can think of the global level, both in identity terms, new ideas of economic, rising powers is emerging, and also changing interest and institutions could be a response to the question.
Thank you. If there is no more reaction from our panel, I'm going to turn to the other question from Eduardo Viola. Do you consider the reaction against leftist identitarianism as an important driver of right-wing populism? Whoever wants to take the question.
I can begin. Thanks, Eduardo, who is my colleague and friend here from Brazil. And I think it's very interesting to think to what extent, I would not say the leaders, but at least the popular support to the right-wing movements in Brazil and the United States particularly, but now also I can think of a similar mechanism in India, is not a reaction against the fact that the left literally left aside ideas of universalism. And something that I'd like to advance in the future, should I have time, resources, and of course, depending on other academic constraints, is to measure whether support to Bolsonaro here in Brazil is stronger in regions where particularly whites, they feel that they were denied opportunities thanks to affirmative action programs. I honestly have a kind of mixed feelings about affirmative action, particularly in Brazil, because unlike in the United States, racial identity has never been very well defined in the country, although of course that has hidden, we must say that, racism, particularly against Blacks. The darker you are in Brazil, certainly you are more likely to face discrimination. But under an academic standpoint, one has to consider seriously that were it not for certain policies carried by the left, and although they were carried in good intention and had positive effects over in terms of diversifying Brazilian society, particularly part of the elite, not very the top elite, but certain segments of the elite, to what extent that didn't offer to the right the opportunity to make a stronger discourse against what used to be the traditional conception of Brazilian national identity based on diversity, and this emphasis on Christianity that also embeds some degree, although in a very shy way, not in an explicit way, of white nationalism. In the United States, I think that's pretty much clear. Again, I'm not here saying that the United States shouldn't have promoted affirmative action. That was, I think, very much needed in a country like the US. However, the side effect, and perhaps the liberal elites should have been better prepared for that side effect, is the mobilization of white poor that now are very much willing to vote for Mr. Trump again, and denied vote already in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. Just think of what happened in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in states that were key. So again, this is not, of course, an opposition against affirmative action policies. I think, depending on the context, they are necessary, as they were, for instance, in India for the lower caste people in the National Front government in '89, and Seema may know more about Indian politics than I do, certainly, so please correct me if I'm making any mistake here, but they implemented affirmative action in the public service for low caste people. And that, many would argue, generated this backlash through the BJP, and that's perhaps not the key part of building the BJP force in recent years. There's more on that story, but certainly that has contributed, as I'm sure that here in Brazil, lots of whites, particularly in the south of Brazil, who used to vote for the left. Some of the most leftist regions in the country used to be in the south, but after years of Workers' Party, Lula's and Dilma's governments, Dilma Rousseff's governments embracing affirmative action, they moved to the right. And I think there is a very strong identitarian component there. Again, this is not to say that I'm against affirmative action or pro identity, some kind of policies that include minorities and, of course, into the mainstream, not at all. But we have to consider how, particularly in case of Brazil and the United States, poor whites regarded those policies. That's an inevitable part of the political equation that we're talking about here.
Thank you. Any reaction from Asima or Zlatko on that? Okay. So I don't see any more questions. Unless someone on the panel wants to do final remarks. No?
Well, if my colleagues are not going to talk, I mean, if they talk afterwards, thank you very much again for your questions, for your comments. I very much appreciate them, the way you engaged with my book. And of course, let's keep in touch about this topic.
Thank you, Vinícius. Thank you. That was a very lively discussion, and we're going to close the session here. And I just want to say stay tuned, because we have another session coming in March, this time on religion and foreign policy, or some call religious diplomacy. So thank you again, and to be continued, really. That was really a very promising for a broader discussion on nation, economy, and market, actually. Thank you. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for involving me. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.